Well, ain't that ironic? Interesting little story, no? Kind of leaves you with a lot of mixed feelings and emotions, I think. Probably. Does for me. Going to talk a little bit about this very, very brief short story. It's a story of an hour, but honestly, it doesn't take that long to read it, I can tell you that. We're going to have a very light online class this week because you got your reader response papers due, and I want to give you time to do that. So we're going to have a quick quiz, and we will not have a discussion session this week. This is such a short piece that I just want you to take a look at it and see how it plugs into some of the other stuff we've been talking about, okay? So let's talk about Kate Chopin. Chopin, very interesting writer, St. Louis native, married a man who was of Creole extraction from Louisiana, and went to live with him for many years, had many children with him, but it was not a happy marriage, not at all. Are you surprised, given Louise Mallard's reaction? Anyway, she writes an awful lot about not so happy marriages and a lot of other things. Her husband eventually died. She did actually separate from him for a while, but he eventually died, and then she went and lived in St. Louis. She loved living in Louisiana. She loved the people there. She loved the culture there, the rich, sort of very diverse culture there. Writes about it a lot. Is considered frequently what we call a regional writer, a writer who's very interested in writing about people and places in a particular region of the United States. So you have some New England writers, and you have Southern writers, and Louisiana writers, and Western writers, and California writers, and these kinds of things, these regional writers. I think that's kind of not fair, because actually I see her themes as stretching well beyond just regional material. I mean, they're the themes that you would want to explore no matter where you lived. But they were themes that were really informed by a particular point in time. She is a late 19th century writer, writing in the 1870s, 80s, etc., 90s, really up to her death at age 19 in the year 1904. Most famous novel is The Awakening. We're not going to do that novel, but I've done it in the past. It's a very famous novel, and it was a very scandalous novel because it dealt with the question of a woman entrapped in a loveless marriage. It's a novel. This is about a two and a half page short story. So, but what you see frequently in Chopin's work is sort of repeated themes, in addition to like the colorful world that she's portraying of Louisiana frequently. The themes of being trapped in a marriage that wasn't fulfilling. What do you do when that's the case? I mean, remember that in the 19th century, divorce just was not a thing. I mean, people did it. You could do it. You could get divorced, but it was very difficult to do. And even if you could legally divorce your spouse, the question was, do you really want to? Because unlike today, there's just an enormous amount of social stigma and shame and embarrassment, and it was a big deal. Today, people tell you that 1 out of every 2 marriages ends in divorce. Actually, that's not true. Only about 32% of first marriages end in divorce. 2 out of 3 first marriages end in divorce. It's the people who get married again that have a fairly high likelihood of getting divorced, and then people who are like on their 4th marriage really end up divorcing. These are like serial divorcers. That's what drives the number way up. So if you've been married like 3 times and get a divorce and you get remarried, you got a really high likelihood of being divorced. I always say, listen, if you've been married 3 times and you got to get a 3rd divorce, maybe you're not the marrying kind. Hey, just a suggestion. That's all I'm saying. But she was trapped in a marriage. And so one of the things that she wants to explore is how marriage is this really restrictive thing, and people feeling pressured to get into a marriage, people being pressured to stay in a marriage, social husband-wife roles being so strict and so restrictive that you can't step outside of them and just be your own person. And why can't people have different types of marriages, right? I mean, some marriages between some people that you may know are characterized by the two people being just like this all the time. Sometimes people have great, wonderful relationships and they're not that physically close, or they can live apart and they live their own lives and things like that. And so anyway, that was a big issue for her, is raising the issue of marriage. The other issue is, and you see this in some of her writing, is about female sexuality. And in that case, she doesn't really explore sort of anything other than heterosexual relationships. But she does talk about sexuality and sexual fulfillment for women, something that was kind of taboo, right? It was just not a thing you talked about. I guess it was just expected that that would not be something that women would be interested in or pursue. It shouldn't be uppermost in their mind. What they should be doing is having sex in order to procreate and have children and fulfill their wifely duties and these kinds of things. And Chopin was really one of the very few voices that said, no, that's not true. Sexual satisfaction for a woman is something she's entitled to from birth. As being a physical creature, we all have physical needs, and there's nothing to be ashamed of, and there's nothing wrong about it. And you're entitled to it. That was kind of a shocking thing. I mean, today we just kind of take that for granted. It's like, yeah, if you're not fulfilled, then you should see a counselor. You should do, couples therapy and stuff like this. You got to talk openly about it. That was just not the case back then. And so she was a real radical in that regard. The role of women in women's employment and what they did professionally. She became a writer. A lot of people still, 200 years after Anne Bradstreet, thought that writing as a career for women was not really a very good one, not a very respectable one. And then family. She seems, to a lot of people, the big critics of Chopin seem to think that she places her own interest above that of her children. And of course, that is a big sticking point. Defenders of Chopin say, no, that's not true. All she's doing is doing what they do in the airplane, which is to say, when the oxygen mask descends, put it on yourself first, because you're not much help to your children if your life isn't in order. But I won't get into that. You can read more Chopin and decide that for yourself. I think there's plenty of reason to be critical, and there's plenty of reason to defend her as a writer. Anyway, so let's dive into this tiny little story. It's really, I call it the story of about 15 minutes, honestly. Big question. Were you surprised by Louisa's reaction to the news of her husband's death? A typical Victorian reader who believed that women should be supportive of their husbands and they should be, thoroughly dedicated to their happiness, and that's what you live for, is your husband's happiness, would have probably been very shocked by her reaction. But I think she's trying to show you a really honest reaction. Now, they might have condemned Louise and said, she's a heartless thing. How could you feel that way? Understand that she's not... you decide how you want to describe her reaction. It starts off with her getting the news. She's very sad. She's very upset. She begins to cry. She decides to go off by herself in a room, and she looks out a window. This is the best window picture I can give you right here. Her looking out the window on a spring day, and she's seeing. The narrator is very subtle in giving you like details of the spring day and new blooms, right? The flowers are coming out. The trees are budding. It's a new time, right? So winter is over, and now what is spring? Spring is the rebirth of life in nature. And she's breathing it in, and she's saying, life is really a beautiful thing. And she dares to whisper something that, other people would be shocked if she said this and admitted this, but she's like, as sad as it is to lose him, I actually will be very free. I'll have a lot of freedom in my life from now on. Now, notice it doesn't say anything about like a life insurance policy, which could make it even better for her. She could be going to Cancun every week, but we don't see that. There's not a pecuniary basis for this newfound happiness. It's more of a question of freedom, because she whispers that to herself: freedom, freedom, freedom. Which I can tell you, to a typical Victorian woman, much less a man, reading this short story would be a bit shocking. It's like, that's not how you're supposed to behave when your husband dies. What kind of person are you? Oh my gosh. Did you want him to die? But the narrator pulls that back and says very carefully here, even though she says, when she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath: free, free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. So when she first got the news, she was just stunned and terrified at what had happened to her husband. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulse beat fast. And the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. So, the first reaction is shock, and your blood runs cold and you're terrified. and she's crying, and she goes off by herself. And then afterwards, she's able to compose herself a little bit, and it sinks in what has happened. And it's sad because she's lost her husband, but she's gained something here, she feels. And she can't help but feel it because she says, I'm sorry, but, this has an upside. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death. She knew that when she saw her husband, in the coffin or whatever at the funeral, that she would weep again. Of course she would, right? It's not as though she doesn't love him, okay? But we read on, it says, the face that had never looked save with love upon her. Her husband never looked on her with anything other than love, right? So he really loves her. And then a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. She thought about, wow, I'm still fairly young here. I've got a lot of years where I can live my life the way I want to, whichever way I want to. This is one thing that people don't think about. We think about 19th century marriage relationships and family and such as being very restrictive, and you have your roles and your duties, and your husband has his roles and duties, and you can't step outside of that, and all of these kinds of things, and to death do us part, whether it kills us or not. But a widow, especially if she had property, especially if she had money, had tremendous freedom once her husband had died. It's some sort of myth that people think that women had absolutely no authority over their lives. If you were a young woman and you were married and you had children and your husband died and you were not impoverished, if you had property, if you had your husband left you a business or a farm, a big farm, or an important, investments, you were an incredibly powerful and autonomous individual. You could live your life just the way you wanted to. You want to go to the beach every week, you can go to the beach every week. And nobody would bother you about it because they would say, well, I mean, she can do what she wants. Unlike a young woman who was single, where you might get a lot of criticism if you went off and did what you wanted. Well, she's off to the beach every week. She should be doing this, or she should be helping her parents, or she should be finding a man, etc., etc. But once you had attained that status as a wife and a mother, if you lose your husband, as long as money wasn't an issue, and of course it was for a lot of people, you pretty much had a lot of respect. You had a lot of authority. You were in the driver's seat when it comes to your life. Unlike how you might have been if you had been younger and single. You didn't have that kind of authority, right? Because in a lot of states, in order for you to transact business, then you would need your husband, or you would need your father, or a brother, or somebody, or the bank wouldn't lend you money, or no one would buy property from you, etc. But once you were a widow, you had the full faith and credit of the government behind you, and you could do things, right? You had power for a change. And so some of the most powerful people in the 19th century were widows, exerting themselves in a way that a married woman, or especially a single young woman, wouldn't have that authority. So that's one of the reasons why she's thinking, I'm a young person, I've got a lot of years ahead of me where I can call my own shots. She opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. I got all these years, and she spreads her arms out and says, I'm looking forward to the rest of my life. So you're the reader's thinking, and the typical person is thinking, oh, she's devastated. She's probably thinking, what am I going to do with my life? She's actually looking and saying, this is terrible, but life is actually going to get better for me in a way. There would have been no one to live for during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe that they have a right to impose a private will on a fellow creature. No one's going to tell me what to do all the time. I can tell other people what I want to do, and they can't stand in my way. So there is a liberation in a way. Now, I guarantee you that a lot of people would have read that line and said, there's nobody to live for but herself, and say, well, that's really selfish. That shows what a selfish psychopath you are and how unnatural you are, because any natural feeling woman would care deeply for the loss of her husband, etc. I'll give you an example. Queen Victoria, when was madly in love with Prince Albert, and by all accounts they had a wonderful love life. they certainly had a lot of kids. And the story, well, you go ahead and read it if you want to. They were quite affectionate with one another, shall we say. She was smitten with him from day one, and he was just, a wonderful husband, very loving, very faithful. And they had a wonderful, but when he died, she was utterly devastated. And for the rest of her life, she wore black every day, everywhere she went, because she was in terrible mourning for her. But that's a different situation, isn't it? Because she was the queen and she was in charge. No one told the queen what to do. Imagine, however, if you had that kind of relationship, but then you lost your husband and you weren't a queen, okay? You were somebody who was always subservient to your husband. And then suddenly you now have the keys to the business in your hands. It might seem rather liberating to you too. And she says, and the narrator tells us, and yet she had loved him sometimes. Often she had not. Wow. Okay. So the one thing you have to give to this short story is that the honesty of it. Chopin is like, look, there are some people who are madly in love with their spouse, and when they lose that spouse, they're just utterly devastated, and sometimes they don't even recover. There are some people who love their spouse, but it's a different kind of love, and it's a different intensity, and they have the ability to say, well, I loved him, and I do love him, but everything has, it's complicated, okay? It's complicated because although I will miss him, there will be advantages in not being married anymore. And that's not to say, as in Chopin's case, that Louise and her husband had a bad marriage. But it's clear that Louise had more reservations than her husband, Brentley, did about her. Because the earlier line was, he always looked upon her with great love and affection. She loved him sometimes, right? Often she hadn't. Okay. And so you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? Is it because she felt like she had to marry him, that she needed to get married? Remember this is a big deal. You guys are really beneficiaries of a lot of people who came before you who changed the way women were treated and regarded in society. As few as 30, 40, 50 years ago, if you were an unmarried woman, they called you an old maid after a certain age, an old maid. And there was a kind of like, well, why didn't you get married? Why are you, are you just undesirable? Are you somebody who nobody wants to, hang out with, or, what's wrong with you kind of thing? It was very difficult for people. I mean, women did. Many women asserted and said, I don't want to get married. And then they would think you were kind of odd. That was true with men too, but not so much, because men can always get away with this. Well, he's just this happy-go-lucky bachelor, free. You can't nail him down, right? But it was expected 30, 40, 50 years ago that every woman always wanted to get married, no matter what. And for the percentage of women out there who said, it's not for me, I don't really want to do that, society treated them kind of pretty poorly in some respects. The assumption was you want to get married, you just couldn't, or you couldn't find anybody, or there's something weird about you, like you got a weird laugh, or your ears are too big. I don't know what. But it was that was kind of the supposition. The default was you would get married. Every woman wants to, and if you didn't, then it's because you must be disappointed in yourself. And there's like, and obviously also, of course, way back in the day, there were women who weren't attracted to men, right? And so what do you do about that? I mean, it's not exactly you come out and say, oh, there's a really simple reason, that I didn't get married to my, to this guy. It's because I'm a lesbian. You really kind of couldn't do that in the 1920s or the 1890s. Not very easily. People did, but you put up with a lot. So, it was kind of one of these positions of being kind of unable to defend yourself in a way. But again, widowhood gave you the singleness and the independence and the autonomy and sometimes the property necessary to say, I'm in charge of my life for a change. I'm not chained to somebody else's desire and have to obey somebody else. Now, given the fact that most women outlive men, That's a thing that's kind of, yeah. And that, by the way, that wasn't always true because many women died in childbirth, or earlier on. But today, women outlive men more often. I mean, you ask any actuarial and life insurance person, and they will tell you that that is certainly the case. So did they love each other? Well, obviously they did, but you got to put a giant asterisk by that when you talk about Louise's love, because there's something there that wasn't the same. It wasn't the same kind of love or intensity or what have you as, for example, her husband's. The irony at the ending, we'll skip down to the end real quick and then we'll end this. It was Brentley Mallard who entered, right? All of a sudden, hello, husband's not dead. He didn't make the train, right? Okay, so he wasn't there. It was Brentley Mallard who entered a little travel stain, composedly carrying his grip sack and umbrella. He had been far from the scene of the accident and didn't even know there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry. Josephine, of course, is Louise's sister. At Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife, but Richard's was too late. And you think, oh, okay, well, she's probably going to be very disappointed in some ways, but probably relieved that her husband's alive. Mixed emotions, probably. Well, we don't get to see any mixed emotions because she just flat out craps over and dies. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of joy that kills. So she kicked a bucket right there, and she dies from heart failure. And they all say, oh, how sad. She was so shocked by the events, first thinking her husband was dead and then afterwards finding out he wasn't, that she died of heart failure from the shock and the strain. And the doctor says she died of joy. Her heart couldn't take the great joy of seeing him again. But we know the truth, don't we? We know the truth that, well, she died for whatever. We're not told, but I don't think I'm going to accept the doctor's diagnosis here other than the heart failure, the reason for the heart failure, because we know that she wasn't all that probably excited about having him come back and return because, her future independence is now gone. That probably weighed on her. I think it's probably safe to say that she died of this, shock, yes, but the shock was brought about because she had some rather mixed emotions and mixed feelings about her husband having survived, right? The irony, of course, also is that once she's dead, well, she's no longer married. She may not be a widow, he's a widower, but she's free of a marriage, just not the way she anticipated, I think. Okay, probably not you either. So, quiz question, just one quiz question. How does what was the event that everyone thought killed Brentley? Okay, what was the event that killed Brentley, supposedly, but he didn't actually die? Okay, send that to me by email by Tuesday at midnight. There's no discussion question. We'll just come in on Thursday. Please do the reading for Thursday's class and make sure that you get your reader response submitted to me by then as well. Okay.